Alright, class, continuing with Aristotle's Rhetoric. Before I talk a little more about Aristotle, let me just update you where I am with your work. I have your first papers, at least most of them. If I don't have a paper from you, I'll let you know. And I'll be grading those this week and getting them back to you as soon as possible. After I'm finished this discussion of Aristotle's Rhetoric, I'm going to sign another paper. I'll sign that on Thursday at the very latest. You'll have over the break, and then a little time after the break to do it. Remember, there's no set deadline or turn-in date for any of these assignments, so you just finish them at your own pace. That's the way I designed the course, so it'll be easy for you. It's a real online, adaptable form of instruction. So let's talk a little bit more about Aristotle, and now let's dive into this book that's called The Rhetoric. And at the very beginning of the Rhetoric, Aristotle says the rhetoric is the counterpart of dialectic. You can see that right here. That word in Greek is actually antistrophos, which is a kind of an interesting word because it's a word that actually comes from music. In music, in Greek music, a strophe or strophe, a strophos, is a musical idea, and an antistrophos, of course, would be the opposite of that idea. So if I went up the scale, the opposite would be to go down the scale. So basically he's using a metaphor to say that rhetoric is a scale going in the opposite direction of dialectic, but kind of has the same notes. Okay, so if you remember from Plato and also my earlier discussion of Aristotle, dialectic is the art of logical discussion. Rhetoric is the art of public communication or public speaking. And so, since both of them use arguments and words and organize ideas and try to get audiences, or in the case of dialectic, the other person, to come along with you in your reasoning process, they have a lot of things in common. So Aristotle is basically breaking from Plato and saying that no, it's not that dialectic is good and rhetoric is bad, is that dialect and rhetoric are both arts of discourse. Okay, so what he's saying is that they go hand in hand. You can study them together. A lot of the things that you learn in dialectic, you learn in rhetoric, and vice versa. Certainly mutually complementary subject matters. Okay, before I go on to the next slide, at the beginning of the next section, Aristotle actually defines rhetoric. And if you've looked at any of the materials that's on the website about Aristotle, about rhetoric, or about his work on rhetoric, you'll quickly come to his famous definition of rhetoric, which is that rhetoric is rhetoric is the faculty of discovering in a given case the available means of persuasion. So let's think about that definition for a minute. First of all, rhetoric is a faculty. When we think of a faculty, we're thinking of a part of our mind or of our cognition. So the sophists defined rhetoric as the art of persuasion, meaning that a person makes an argument because they want to persuade. But Aristotle is saying that rhetoric is the faculty of discovering the available means of persuasion in a given case. That's a very different definition. It means that for Aristotle, the focus of rhetorical studies is not on the persuasion, but on what goes on inside your mind, in other words, in that faculty. And as a result, almost this entire system of rhetoric is about mental activity, in other words, coming up with arguments, finding arguments, organizing arguments, evaluating arguments, using the proper logical processes in developing arguments. So this is a very good distinction to keep in mind, that Aristotle is saying that rhetoric is not about persuasion. It's about finding arguments which might actually prove to be persuasive when used. That's a very, very different thing. For Aristotle, success in rhetoric is not in winning. Success in rhetoric is advancing arguments that may or may not win. But if they win, that's just a bonus because they're good arguments which happen to be accepted by audiences. Okay, rhetoric and dialectic are concerned with things that do not belong to a definite genus or category and are not the object of a specific science. So you remember that Plato criticized rhetoric for not having a subject matter. Aristotle's response, Well, neither does dialectic have a subject matter. You can have a dialectical discussion about anything. You can use rhetoric to talk about anything. Rhetoric and dialectic both rely on accepted sentences or ideas. In other words, what are called commonplaces. And everybody basically starts with the same set of assumptions and the same set of meanings assigned to words and phrases. Rhetoric and dialectic are not dependent on the principles of certain sciences. So you don't have to be a physician to make a speech about medicine. You don't have to be a physicist to make a speech about the rotation of the planets. So your training in a particular subject matter doesn't lead to rhetorical ability, but training in rhetoric leads you to the ability to talk about any subject about which you have knowledge or have been skilled. Rhetoric and dialectic are concerned with both sides of an opposition, meaning that they both are into this idea of controversy, dispute, debate, there being two sides to every issue. Rhetoric and dialectic both rely on deduction and induction, meaning that they use logical proof and they also use what's called empirical proof or scientific proof. Deduction means that you formulate an argument in which the premises guarantee the conclusion. Induction means that you find an example or multiple examples that support a general conclusion. Rhetoric and dialectic similarly apply to the so-called topoi, and topoi are topics. In other words, things that can be discussed over and over again in different contexts by different people. As a matter of fact, topoi or topica, as it's called in Latin, is the subject matter of Aristotle's book on dialectic. It is in fact called Topics. So, rhetoric does have its own identity as an art and a science. Aristotle disagrees with his teacher Plato, and therefore it is not cookery or a sham, as Plato would have led us to believe. It is not immoral because the use of rhetoric doesn't necessarily imply immorality. It just means that whoever uses it can use it for either moral or immoral means. And I think Aristotle actually says that what makes somebody as a sophist is his moral purpose, not the fact that he uses rhetoric. So some people could use rhetoric for good and some could use it for evil. So therefore, rhetoric is simply a thing that we use. It's a linguistic ability. It's very pragmatic. It has purposes and usefulness. It's also scientific when that you can discover its principles and you can organize and systematize it. So it's certainly not a problem. And now getting back to the definition, it's a study of all the available means of persuasion and functions to discover in each context the best way to be successful. So it is, again, a faculty or a cognizance that you have of what might or might not be a successful way to argue. Okay. One of the things I mentioned last time, and I'll repeat now because Aristotle repeats this in this point in the rhetoric. Rhetoric is useful because it prevents fraud and injustice. It aids instruction. Obviously, as we research a topic that we're going to speak about, we have to become educated in it. It makes us argue both sides of a question because we are forced to recognize that there is an opposing or adversarial position to ours, and helps us in defending ourselves. Remember, if we're defending the truth and somebody's coming at us with untruth, we have rhetoric to aid our side so the truth can defend itself. So the definition of rhetoric, Aristotle defines the rhetorician as someone who is always able to see what is persuasive. He actually did that in the Topics. And correspondingly, rhetoric is defined in the book Rhetoric itself, the ability, or the faculty as I called it before, to see what is possibly persuasive in every given case. This is not to say that the rhetorician will be able to convince under all circumstances. Rather, he is in a similar situation to the physician. The latter has a complete grasp of his art, only if he neglects nothing which might heal his patient, though he is not able to heal every patient. Similarly, the rhetorician has a complete grasp of his method if he discovers the available means of persuasion, though he is not able to convince everybody or in every situation. So this is a much more nuanced and sophisticated view of what rhetoric is, because here rhetoric is finding arguments, but not necessarily trying to say that the arguments will work. And the physician analogy is great because think about it. If you God forbid had some sort of cancer and the doctor was going to prescribe a cocktail of chemotherapy to fight it, some people would respond to the chemotherapy and some people would not. Well, the same thing's true with argument. Some people respond to certain arguments and some people don't. So finding the best arguments is a different process from making the arguments and seeing if they work. Okay, now one of the great things that Aristotle contributed is he divided up rhetoric into what we call genres, and that means different types of rhetoric. The first type is called epideictic. Epideictic is a big Greek word which really means ceremonial, and ceremonial speeches are about values. Examples of ceremonial speeches are graduation speeches, after dinner speeches, wedding toasts, eulogies, dedications of a building, patriotic speeches. So these are speeches for occasions, things that we regularly recognize as important in our society, and we grant a certain value to them. And the speeches, by the way, are characterized by the re-emphasis of values. You don't, for example, see at a graduation people making policy speeches or making arguments about scientific things necessarily. They're basically talking about the great thing that you celebrate on the day that you graduate, which is the fact that you've achieved an education, you have a future ahead, you're going to fulfill an important role in society, and you reinforce the values of education and why it was a good thing for you to get a degree. Forensic rhetoric is rhetoric designed for the courts. And it is true that in the courts, most of the issues that we argue about are factual issues. If you've ever seen a trial, you know that the judge instructs the jury to determine what the facts are in the case as based in what they've heard from the testimony of the witnesses. So the jury becomes a fact-finding body. They go back into the room, they deliberate what did or did not happen. Did this person commit this crime? Were these facts of this contract in place when this person signed this document? So forth, and they determine those facts, and the outcome is based on that. By the way, most of the sophists and what they did in instructing in rhetoric was about forensic oratory. Finally, deliberative. Deliberative has to do with policy. This is what the Congress does, what deliberative assemblies do, what bodies that make policies or deliberate about motions do. Aristotle thought this was the least discussed and yet the most important type of rhetoric, deliberative rhetoric. He was very disappointed that the sophists focused on forensic, whereas they ought to be focusing on deliberative, because the most important questions facing people in the ancient Greek world, as they probably are for us too, are questions that affect how our society runs and how it responds to its problems. Notice, by the way, that there's also a time orientation with these three types of speech. Epideictic is focused on the present. Like I said, when you go to a graduation, you're focused on the now. This is something that's happening right now. We're celebrating this event today. Forensic is definitely focused on the past because most of the things that are in dispute in a trial have already occurred. Deliberative is about the future because we're trying to find out what we need to do to fix the problems in our society, our country. Now, Aristotle introduces a really great concept in the rhetoric. It's called the enthymeme. The enthymeme is nothing more than a version of something you may have studied in another class called the syllogism. But Aristotle said that when we argue deductively, by the way, that we don't really spell out syllogistically everything we're trying to say. Look at this example. Socrates is a man, so Socrates is immortal. We don't actually say out loud, all men are mortal. Just like, for example, if I say, Dr. Weiss is a college professor, so Dr. Weiss is probably liberal. Why? Because people generally think of college professors as having a liberal political orientation. So that hidden premise is something that you, the audience, can provide. The reader doesn't have to say it, and they can do the logical work. This is the way we tend to argue most of our arguments and speeches. Also, because we share values with the audience, they can fill in the missing premise and do the work for us. So that's the second part of that. Now, Aristotle also says that there are certain types of proof. Okay? And by this he means that there are things that are within the control of the speaker, but there are also things that are not in control of the speaker. So what's in control of the speaker? These are called artistic proofs. The first one is called logos. We think of that as logical arguments or words or the ideas that are expressed in the speech itself. So for Aristotle, a logician and philosopher, this has to be a very important part of the speech or the act of producing rhetoric, because after all, as I said before, he describes rhetoric as the faculty of discovering in a given case the available means of persuasion. For him, those available means of persuasion are good arguments, and finding logical arguments is very important. Then he talks about pathos, which is human emotions. Not irrational or non-rational, or in Gorgias's view, where people are easily persuaded because they're irrational, but rather a cataloging of human emotions. In the third book of the Rhetoric, Aristotle goes through all the emotions and talks about them. Now, of course, this was the infancy of the study of psychology, so what he has to say about emotions is pretty ridiculous, but nevertheless, he recognized the psychology of the audience was important, and today we tend to think of that as a very, very important variable. Also, he talked about ethos, which is the character, the goodness, or the virtue of the speaker. In other words, how the speaker is perceived. And even though Aristotle felt that logos was important for finding logical arguments, he recognized that ethos was, in fact, the strongest form of artistic proof. Why? Because the character of the speaker is the whole filter through which an argument is made. So, for example, if there was some really scurrilous character who was giving a speech, we would tend to discount what he was saying, even if it was a good argument. But if there was somebody of high character and who was virtuous who was giving the same speech, we might be really enthralled by it simply because we had such a good view of him or her. Now, there's also something called inartistic proof, which is basically the stuff that we call evidence in a trial. A murder weapon, a contract, affidavits. And notice it says here tortured slaves, because what was extracted from people during torture was just considered to be a fact, even though we know today that people will say anything under torture. Okay, so what did Aristotle do for rhetoric? He first of all argued, unlike Plato, that it was the counterpart to dialectic. It was an area of study, a power, a faculty. The Greek word for that is dunamis. He provided the genres of rhetoric: epidictic, forensic, deliberative. He talked about the inartistic and the artistic, inartistic and artistic forms of proof. The artistic being ethos, pathos, logos, and the inartistic being the objects you could produce. He also introduced the idea of the enthymeme, which is spelled wrong there, by the way. It's E-N-T-H-Y-M-E-M-E. That should be an M. And he introduced the idea of topoi, commonplaces, ideas that are used over and over again in arguments. And finally, he left open the question, which was originally raised by the sophists and also by Plato: is rhetoric an art? Is it a techne, or is it a knack? We still don't know. Now, there's some stuff that we're going to learn about later in the course, which I won't go into now, which is all based in Aristotle, but we'll skip that. Instead, let's do a little bit of looking at artwork. This painting that you're looking at is very famous. It's in the Vatican in Italy. It's called The School of Athens. It was painted by Raphael, who you may know as one of the Ninja Turtles. The painting is a depiction of ancient philosophy, and some of the people that we've learned about are in this picture. For example, this gentleman here on the right is Aristotle. To the left of him is Plato. And somewhere over here, see if I can find him, standing around in a group. I'm surveying. I'm looking for Socrates. I'm not seeing him, but maybe I'll get a close-up and we can see him. So here's a slightly better view. Again, here's Aristotle. Here's Plato. Notice Aristotle's pointing to the ground, Plato pointing to the heavens. And I'm not seeing Socrates. Oh, here's Socrates right here. turning to the left. Here's a good close-up of the Plato and Aristotle figures. And there's Socrates again. And this is supposed to be a philosopher named Heraclitus. And this is actually a portrait of Michelangelo that Raphael painted, and he depicted him as Heraclitus. And you'll notice, by the way, that this painting by Michelangelo, which is on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, looks very similar in style to the painting that Raphael did of Michelangelo. So he was kind of copying Michelangelo's painting style. They were contemporaries, by the way, and were working in the Vatican at the exact same time. I just also thought I would share with you some of the accomplishments that the Greeks made, not only in rhetoric and philosophy, but also in art. This is a Greek statue of a discus thrower. It's a full torso bronze. You can see it's pretty amazing, very realistic anatomically, even though it was sculpted over almost 2,500 years ago. And here's a Roman copy of that same sort of a statue. This is a head of Athena, who was the god of Athens. Of course, everything that we've been talking about in terms of ancient Greece has been happening in Athens, so I thought it'd be worthwhile to see her. And here's a Roman orator. Could possibly even be Cicero. We haven't talked about Rome yet. We're going to do that next. But that's what he looked like. And here's some Greek architecture. This is the famous Parthenon, which is at the top of the Acropolis in Athens. Some of you may have traveled there and seen this. It was the great temple that Pericles built to honor Athena. It's another view of it. And this is Delphi, and this is the spot where Socrates went and consulted the oracle. Now, the oracle was a woman, and she went into a trance, and then you could ask her questions, and she could supposedly answer those questions. And that was where the question was posed about who was the wisest man, and the oracle told Socrates that he was the wisest man because he was the only man that knew that he knew nothing. The Socratic paradox that I mentioned before. Now, this is Roman architecture, and we're going to be talking about Rome next. But Roman architecture is very different. They built, for example, these arches, which the Greeks did not. And they built these gigantic structures, some of which are very much intact. This is called the Pantheon. It's in Rome. It was built within the first 3 centuries after Christ, and it's a 100% intact ancient building. It's now a church, by the way. And of course, the famous Colosseum, which was the first gigantic stadium in Western civilization, and again still stands largely intact. One of the most visited structures in the world, and remarkable to see. Okay, so that wraps it up. My next topic is going to be Rome and Roman rhetoric. We will always be harping back to what Plato and Aristotle said about rhetoric, but I think you have enough of a basis now to think about rhetoric from Aristotle's viewpoint. And as I said, on Thursday I'll be giving you your second paper assignment, and I'll also be working on grading your first one. So thanks for listening. Don't hesitate to call or email me or post questions on the website if you have any concerns. I want this class to work for you, so keep in touch. Thanks.